Hey there. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most complex, contradictory, and captivating figures in all of mythology. Not a hero, not quite a villain, but something far more interesting. Something human, despite being anything but. We're talking about Loki, the trickster god of Norse mythology, the shapeshifter, the liar, the blood brother of Odin himself, the one who brought both gifts and ruin to the gods of Asgard. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it brings you peace. And let me know in the comments who your favorite Norse god is. Now settle in, dim the lights, let the fires of Muspelheim flicker in your imagination. Let the ice of Niflheim cool your thoughts. And let's begin at the very beginning, in a cosmos built from the body of a giant, where the rules were always stranger than we could imagine. The 9 worlds and the stage for chaos. Before we can understand Loki, we need to understand the world he inhabited. The Norse cosmos wasn't a single realm with a heaven above and an earth below. It was 9 interconnected worlds, all growing from the roots and branches of Yggdrasil, the world tree, an ash so vast that its branches sheltered entire realms and its roots drank from wells of fate itself. At the top sat Asgard, home of the Aesir gods. These were the rulers, the warriors, the shapers of destiny. Odin, the All-Father, walked its golden halls. Thor's laughter echoed from his great feasting table. Frigg wove the threads of fate in her chambers. This was a realm of power, of order, of divine authority, or at least, that's what they wanted to believe. Connected to Asgard by the Rainbow Bridge was Midgard, the middle realm, the world of humans. Mortal men and women carved out their lives between the sea and the mountains, always aware that giants lurked beyond their borders and gods watched from above. They offered sacrifices, told stories, and hoped that when their time came, they might be worthy of Valhalla or Folkvanga, the halls where warriors feasted after death. Then there was Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, the Jotuna. This was a place of wild mountains, endless forests, and ancient magic. The giants were older than the gods themselves, born from the primal forces of creation. They were chaos personified, nature unchained, the raw elements given form and thought. They were not always evil, but they were dangerous, unpredictable, and they remembered a time before the gods ruled. Other realms filled out the cosmos. Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods, those associated with fertility and prosperity. Alfheim, where the light elves dwelled in eternal brightness. Svartalfheim, the realm of the dwarves, master craftsmen who worked in the depths of the earth, forging treasures beyond mortal comprehension. Niflheim, the realm of Aethag and mist. Muspelheim, the realm of fire, guarded by the giant Surtur, who would one day burn the world. Helheim, the realm of the dead for those who did not die in battle. And Nidavellir, sometimes counted separately, another realm of the dwarves. 9 worlds, all connected, all influencing each other, and moving between them more freely than perhaps anyone should have been able to, was Loki. The stranger among gods. Loki's very existence was a contradiction. He lived in Asgard. He walked among the Aesir as one of them. He sat at their feasts, joined their councils, and adventured alongside their mightiest warriors. But Loki was not Aesir. He was Jotun, a giant, born of the very forces the gods defined themselves against. His father was Farbauti, a name that means cruel striker, associated with lightning and the destructive force of storms. His mother was Laufey, also called Nal, whose name meant leafy or needle, perhaps connecting her to the fragile, temporary nature of plant life. From these two came Loki, whose very name might mean fire, or to close, to end. Even in his naming, there was duality, the potential for warmth and destruction both. He had brothers, Helblindi, whose name meant Hellblinder, and Bylist, about whom almost nothing is known. But these brothers fade into obscurity in the stories that survived. Loki's true sibling bond, the one that mattered, was not one of blood, but of choice. Odin and Loki were blood brothers, not by birth, but by oath. In the Viking Age, such oaths were sacred, unbreakable bonds that made two men closer than kin. The exact circumstances of this oath-taking are lost to time, but the poetic Edda mentions it, and it explains everything that follows. It explains why Loki was tolerated in Asgard despite his nature. It explains why Odin defended him when others wanted him gone. It explains why, when Loki finally went too far, the betrayal cut so deeply. What could make the All-Father, the wise wanderer, who sacrificed his eye for knowledge and hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to gain the runes, swear brotherhood with a giant? Perhaps Odin saw in Loki something useful. The trickster's cunning, his ability to slip between worlds, his talent for solving problems in ways no honorable god would consider. Or perhaps Odin, who valued knowledge and wisdom above all things, recognized in Loki a mind that matched his own, a cleverness that could challenge and complement his plans. Or maybe, just maybe, there was genuine friendship there once, before everything went wrong. Loki's appearance was never fully described in the ancient sources, but we know he was beautiful. The gods of Asgard were beings of terrible beauty, and Loki fit among them. He could be charming when he wished, his words silver, his smile disarming. But there was always something about him that unsettled people. A gleam in the eye, a twist to the smile, the sense that he was laughing at a joke no one else had heard yet. And perhaps he was, because Loki could see what others couldn't. He could see the cracks in Asgard's golden facade. He could see the fear beneath Thor's bluster, the calculation beneath Odin's wisdom, the vanity in Freya's beauty. He could see that the gods, for all their power, were just as flawed and foolish as anyone else. This made him dangerous, not because he was evil, not at first, but because he was free in a way the others weren't. The Aesir had built a society based on honor, on reputation, on maintaining face and following rules. Loki didn't care about any of that. He would lie if it suited him. He would cheat, steal, seduce, or flee. He had no honor to protect because he had never claimed any. This also made him useful. When the gods needed something done that couldn't be accomplished through strength or wisdom or straightforward means, they turned to Loki. When they needed someone to slip into Jotunheim and steal something back, Loki went. When they needed a problem to disappear in a way that left no one's hands technically dirty, Loki handled it. He was the shadow the gods cast, the necessary evil, the one who did the things they needed done but couldn't admit to needing, the family of monsters. But if Loki's relationship with the Aesir was complicated, his family life was absolutely catastrophic. He had 2 sets of children, and between them, they would bring about the end of the world. His wife, recognized by the gods and accepted in Asgard, was Sigyn. She was a goddess of unclear origin, loyal and faithful to a degree that seems almost tragic. She bore Loki 2 sons, Narfi and Vali. These boys were innocent as much as anyone in Norse mythology could be innocent, and their fate would be one of the cruelest in all the tales. But we'll come to that later, in the darkest part of Loki's story. Before Sigyn, or perhaps alongside her, depending on which source you trust, Loki had another family, a secret one, a monstrous one. In Jotunheim, Loki took up with a giantess named Angerboda, whose name meant she who brings grief, or anguish boding. If ever a name was prophetic, it was hers. Together, in the wild places far from Asgard's golden halls, they had 3 children, and these 3 would become the gods' greatest nightmares. The first was Fenrir, the great wolf. Even as a pup, Fenrir grew at an alarming rate, his jaws already capable of crushing stone, his howl capable of shaking the roots of mountains. The gods looked at this wolf and saw their doom. Prophecy whispered that Fenrir would one day kill Odin himself, and prophecy in Norse mythology was not a warning, it was a promise, an unalterable future carved into the fabric of fate. The second was Jörmungandr, the world serpent. This snake grew so large that Odin himself took it and cast it into the ocean surrounding Midgard, hoping distance would contain the threat. It didn't. Jörmungandr grew until it encircled the entire world, grasping its own tail in its mouth, a living boundary between the known and the unknown. Thor would one day face this serpent at Ragnarök, and both would die in that confrontation. The third was Hel, and she was perhaps the strangest of all. She was half living flesh, half corpse, beautiful on one side and rotting on the other, the embodiment of death's duality. Odin took her and cast her down into the darkest realm, Niflheim, and there she became the ruler of the dead, queen of those who died of sickness or old age, rather than in glorious battle. Her hall was called Eljudnir, sprayed with snowstorms, and her table was called Hunger, her knife Famine. She would play a crucial role later, when the gods came to her begging for a life back. 3 children, and each one a pillar of Ragnarök, the end of all things. The gods knew this. The prophecies were clear, and yet they let Loki live among them. They let him feast in their halls and drink their mead and speak in their councils. Why? Because of Odin's oath, yes, but also because they needed him. They needed his cleverness. They needed his ability to fix the problems that strength couldn't solve. And Loki gave them that. Again and again, he saved them from their own foolishness, even as he sometimes caused the problems in the first place. He was the poison and the cure, the fire that destroyed and the fire that warmed, the lie that protected and the lie that ruined. But there's one more piece to Loki's family that we need to mention, one more offspring that shows just how strange the trickster could be. Because Loki didn't just father monsters. Once he mothered one too, the mother of Sleipnir. Yes, you read that right. Loki, the male god, gave birth. And this story tells you everything you need to know about how fluid and strange Loki truly was. It began with a wall. Asgard's defenses had been damaged in a war with the Vanir, another tribe of gods, and the Aesir needed their fortifications rebuilt. But the work was enormous, and they had no one to do it. Then a stranger arrived, a builder, who offered to reconstruct the entire wall around Asgard. He would make it impregnable, tall enough and strong enough to keep out any giant, any threat. His price? The sun, the moon, and the goddess Freya as his wife. The gods laughed at this. The price was absurd, impossible. No one could build such a wall in the time available. But Loki, always ready with a clever scheme, suggested they accept the offer with conditions. The builder would have to complete the work in a single winter, before the first day of summer, and he had to do it alone, with no help from any man. The builder agreed, with one request. He could use his horse, Svadilfari, to help haul the stones. It seemed reasonable enough. What harm could one horse do? The gods agreed. They shouldn't have, because Svadilfari was no ordinary horse. He was a giant stallion, powerful beyond measure, tireless, capable of moving stones that would have required a dozen men. And the builder himself worked with superhuman speed and strength because, of course, he was no ordinary man. He was a giant in disguise, a master mason from Jotunheim who saw an opportunity to steal Asgard's greatest treasures. As winter drew on, the wall rose, higher and higher, stone upon stone, faster than anyone had thought possible. The gods began to panic. The work was nearly complete, and summer was still 3 days away. They were going to lose. They were going to have to give up the sun, plunging the world into darkness. They were going to lose the moon, destroying the cycles of time. And they were going to hand over Freya, the most beautiful of goddesses, to a giant. The gods turned on Loki. This was his idea, his clever plan, and now they were facing disaster. They threatened him, surrounded him, demanded he fix this. And Loki, ever the survivor, agreed. He would ensure the builder failed. That night, as the giant's horse Svadilfari was dragging another load of stones toward the wall, a beautiful mare appeared in the forest. She whinnied, tossed her mane, and ran off into the trees. Svadilfari, driven by instinct, broke free of his harness and chased after her. All night they ran through the forest, the stallion pursuing the mare, while the builder raged and searched for his horse. By the time Svadilfari returned, exhausted and spent, summer had arrived. The wall stood incomplete, just a few stones short of finished. The builder, revealed now in his fury as a giant, flew into a rage. Thor, summoned by the gods, appeared with his hammer Mjolnir and crushed the giant's skull, ending the threat. Asgard was safe. The sun and moon remained in the sky. Freya stayed among the gods. And Loki disappeared for a time. When he returned, many months later, he was leading a foal. An 8-legged foal, grey as storm clouds, faster than the wind itself. This was Sleipnir, the greatest of all horses, born from Loki in the form of a mare, and the giant stallion Svadilfari. Loki gave Sleipnir to Odin, and the All-Father rode this 8-legged wonder across the 9 worlds, between the realms of living and dead, through sky and sea. Sleipnir could gallop over water, through air, and even into Helheim itself. He was a gift beyond price. But think about what this story tells us. Loki transformed himself into a mare, not just in appearance, but completely, fully, to the point of conception and birth. He spent months pregnant. He gave birth. This wasn't illusion or trickery. It was transformation so complete that biology itself bent to accommodate it. This is what made Loki terrifying to the orderly, honor-bound Aesir. He wasn't bound by anything, not by gender, not by form, not by loyalty or truth, or even the basic categories that defined existence. He was liquid where they were solid, chaos where they craved order, and they needed that chaos, even as it frightened them. The trickster's nature. So who was Loki, really? What drove him? The sources don't agree, and maybe that's appropriate for a being so contradictory. In some stories, he's almost playful, his tricks harmless pranks that cause embarrassment but little real harm. In others, he's cruel, his schemes designed to humiliate and hurt. In still others, he's a problem solver, using his cunning to save the gods from threats they created themselves. He was called Loki Laufeyjarson, Loki son of Laufey, taking his mother's name rather than his father's, which was unusual in the patriarchal Norse society. Some scholars think this indicates his father was shameful or unknown, but others suggest it connects him to the earth, to the natural world, through his mother's association with leaves and needles. He was called the sly god, the slanderer of gods, the origin of deceit, and the disgrace of all gods and men. But he was also called the cunning god and the wizard. His titles reflected the fear and suspicion the gods felt toward him, but also their grudging respect for his abilities. Loki could shapeshift into anything: a salmon, a fly, a seal, an old woman, a falcon. His transformations were complete, not mere glamours or illusions. When he became a salmon to hide from the god's wrath, he was a salmon, thinking with a salmon's brain, breathing through gills. The gods had to catch him like a fish, and they did, inventing the fishing net in the process. He was a master of flighting, the Norse art of insult combat, where two participants trade increasingly elaborate and cutting barbs. The Lokasena, Loki's Quarrel, is an entire poem dedicated to Loki, crashing a feast of the gods and insulting each one in turn, exposing their secrets and shames with gleeful malice. He called Odin a coward and a practitioner of ergi, unmanly magic. He accused Freya of sleeping with all the gods and elves in the room, including her own brother. He mocked Thor as a cuckold and a fool. He went through the entire assembly, burning bridges with every word, and he seemed to enjoy every moment of it. But why? What was the point? Some scholars see Loki as a fire deity, his name potentially related to Logi, the Old Norse word for flame. Fire is useful, warming homes and cooking food, but it's also destructive, consuming everything it touches. Fire doesn't choose between burning the wicked and the innocent. It just burns. Maybe Loki was the same, neither good nor evil, just a force that acted according to his nature. Others see him as a trickster figure, similar to Anansi in West African mythology, Coyote in Native American stories, or Reynard the Fox in European folklore. Tricksters exist in a liminal space between order and chaos, between civilization and wilderness, between the powerful and the powerless. They break rules to expose the absurdity of the rules. They humble the proud and elevate the low. They're agents of change, uncomfortable but necessary. Still others see him as a scapegoat, a figure who absorbs the blame for all the things the gods need done, but can't admit to doing. When the gods need to break an oath, Loki does it for them. When they need someone to lie or steal or murder, Loki handles it, and then they can condemn him for it, maintaining their own honor while benefiting from his dishonor. There's probably truth in all of these interpretations. Loki was fire and trickster and scapegoat. He was all of these things and none of them because he refused to be pinned down, defined, contained. But there's one more possibility, one that the surviving sources hint at, but never quite say outright. Maybe Loki was just angry at being caught between two worlds, never fully accepted in Asgard because of his giant blood, never truly belonging in Jotunheim because of his oath to Odin. angry at being used by the gods when they needed him and condemned when they didn't, angry at a cosmos that claimed to value honor but constantly demanded he act without it. And maybe, beneath all the tricks and transformations and terrible jokes, Loki was lonely. His wife Sigyn loved him, truly, but she was the only one. His children were monsters, cast out and imprisoned. His blood brother Odin used him as a tool. Thor tolerated him at best, suspected him at worst. The other gods feared and despised him, so he lashed out. He played tricks, he caused problems. He made them remember he existed, even if they hated him for it, because being hated was better than being forgotten. Or maybe we're overthinking it. Maybe Loki was exactly what he appeared to be, a chaos agent who delighted in stirring up trouble because order bored him, and watching the mighty stumble amused him. The beauty of Loki is that we can't know for sure. The sources that survived are fragmentary, written down by Christian monks centuries after the Viking Age ended, filtered through layers of cultural change and fading memory. What we have are pieces of a puzzle, and the picture they make depends on how you arrange them. What we do know is that Loki's story is essential to Norse mythology. Remove him, and the entire narrative collapses. The gods wouldn't have their treasures. Thor wouldn't have his hammer. Odin wouldn't have Sleipnir. Asgard wouldn't have its wall. But also, Baldr wouldn't die. The gods wouldn't be bound to their doom. Ragnarök might never come. Loki was the price the gods paid for their glory. He gave them everything they needed to rule the cosmos, and in the end, he would take it all away. The early adventures, before we get to the darker turns in Loki's tale, let's spend time with the trickster in his earlier days, when his schemes were still more clever than catastrophic, when the gods still trusted him enough to adventure with him, when the laughter at his tricks was genuine rather than nervous. One of the earliest stories involves the goddess Idun and her precious apples. Idun was the keeper of the golden apples of immortality, the fruit that kept the gods young and vital. Without these apples, the Aesir would age and wither like mortals, their power fading, their lives finally ending. One day, Odin, Loki, and the god Honir were traveling through the wilderness when they grew hungry. They found a herd of oxen and killed one, building a fire to roast the meat. But no matter how long they kept the ox over the flames, the meat wouldn't cook. It remained raw and cold, as if the fire itself had no power. Then they heard a voice from above. An eagle sat in the tree overhead, enormous and proud. "I'm preventing your fire from cooking," the eagle said. "But if you share your meal with me, I'll let it cook." The gods agreed. What choice did they have? But when the meat was finally roasted and the eagle descended to claim its share, it took the best parts, the choicest cuts, leaving almost nothing for the gods themselves. Loki, angry and hungry, grabbed a large stick and struck at the eagle. But the stick adhered to the bird, and Loki's hands stuck to the stick. The eagle took flight, dragging Loki behind it, smashing him against rocks and trees, pulling him through thorn bushes and over jagged ground. Loki screamed for mercy, and finally, the eagle spoke. It was no ordinary bird, it was Thjazi, a powerful giant, and he had a demand. He would release Loki only if the trickster swore to bring him Idun and her apples. Loki, in agony, swore the oath. The eagle released him, and Loki limped back to his companions, saying nothing about what had transpired. Back in Asgard, Loki approached Idun with honeyed words. He told her he'd found a grove of apples in the forest that might be even more potent than hers. She should come see them, bringing her own apples for comparison. Trusting and innocent, Idun agreed. As soon as they were outside Asgard's walls, Thjazi appeared in eagle form and snatched Idun away, carrying her and her apples to his hall in Jotunheim. The gods began to age. Grey crept into their hair, their skin wrinkled, their strength waned. Panic set in. Where was Idun? Who had seen her last? The trail led to Loki, and the gods seized him, threatening him with torture and death if he didn't bring her back. Loki, ever the survivor, borrowed Freya's falcon cloak, a magical garment that allowed the wearer to fly in bird form. He flew to Jotunheim, to Thjazi's hall, and found Idun locked in a tower, weeping and afraid. Thjazi was away, hunting at sea. Loki transformed Idun into a nut and clutched her in his talons, flying as fast as the falcon cloak would carry him back toward Asgard. But Thjazi returned and saw the escape. He shifted back into eagle form and gave chase, his wings like thunder, his speed terrible. The gods, watching from Asgard's walls, saw Loki fleeing with Thjazi close behind. They piled up wood shavings just inside the walls and set them ablaze as Loki crossed the boundary. The falcon cleared the flames, but Thjazi, larger and less maneuverable, flew directly into the fire. His feathers ignited, and he fell, crashing to the ground, where Thor finished him with Mjolnir. Idun was restored. The gods ate her apples and regained their youth. Asgard was saved, and Loki was the hero, even though he'd been the one to cause the problem in the first place. This pattern repeated itself many times. Loki would cause a crisis through carelessness or coercion, and then fix it through cleverness, and the gods would forgive him because they needed him. They needed his ability to slip between worlds, to think in ways they couldn't, to be unbound by the honor that constrained them. But each time, the trust eroded a little more. Each time, the resentment built. Each time, the question grew louder. How long until Loki goes too far? The theft of Sif's hair. Another early tale shows Loki's cruel sense of humor and the lengths the gods would go to make him fix his mischief. Sif was Thor's wife, and her most striking feature was her hair, long and golden, so beautiful it was said to shine like the sun on wheat fields. One night, while Sif slept, Loki crept into her chamber with shears and cut off all her hair, leaving her bald and humiliated. Why? The sources don't say. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he was bored. Or maybe, in some versions of the story scholars have pieced together from fragments, there was a suggestion of something darker, an assault or violation that the later Christian scribes euphemized into mere hair cutting. Regardless of the reason, Thor's rage was legendary. He seized Loki and would have crushed his bones to powder if the trickster hadn't begged for mercy and promised to fix everything. He would get Sif new hair, he swore, hair made of real gold that would grow like natural hair and be even more beautiful than before. Loki went to Svartalfheim, the realm of the dwarves, and found the sons of Ivaldi, master craftsmen without peer. He challenged them, flattered them, and convinced them to make not just golden hair for Sif, but other treasures as well. The dwarves worked their forges, and the results were magnificent. They created the golden hair, which would attach to Sif's head and grow naturally. They forged Skidbladnir, a ship so large it could hold all the gods, yet so cunningly made It could be folded up and carried in a pouch. The ship would always have favorable wind when its sails were raised, and they crafted Gungnir, a spear that would never miss its target once thrown. Loki took these treasures and planned to bring them to the gods, but his nature couldn't resist one more trick, one more gamble. He visited another pair of dwarf brothers, Brokkr and Eitri, and bet them that they couldn't make treasures as fine as those of Ivaldi's sons. If they succeeded, Brokkr could have Loki's head. The dwarves accepted the challenge. Eitri placed pigskin in the forge and told his brother Brokkr to work the bellows without stopping, no matter what, while he spoke incantations. Brokkr pumped the bellows steadily, but Loki, desperate to win his bet, transformed into a fly and bit Brokkr's hand. The dwarf kept pumping. From the forge came Gullinbursti, a golden boar that could run through air and water faster than any horse, and whose mane glowed to light the darkest night. Next, Eitri placed gold in the forge and repeated his instructions. Again, Loki as a fly bit Brokkr, this time on the neck, drawing blood. Again, Brokkr didn't stop. From the flames emerged Draupnir, a golden ring that would drip 8 new rings of equal weight every 9th night, an eternal source of wealth. For the third treasure, Eitri placed iron in the forge. This time, Loki bit Brokkr on the eyelid, and blood ran into the dwarf's eye. For just a moment, he paused to wipe it away, and in that moment, the bellows stopped. When Eitri pulled the final treasure from the forge, it was Mjolnir, the hammer of thunder, a weapon so powerful it could level mountains and so perfectly balanced it would always return to the hand that threw it. But because of that brief pause, the handle was slightly too short. It was the only flaw in an otherwise perfect weapon. Loki and Brokkr brought all the treasures to Asgard and presented them to the gods for judgment. Loki gave the golden hair to Sif, and it attached and grew, restoring her beauty. He gave Skidbladnir to Freyr, who delighted in the magical ship. He gave Gungnir to Odin, who accepted the spear that would become his signature weapon. Then Brokkr presented his creations. Gullinbursti went to Freyr as well, giving him 2 magnificent gifts. Draupnir went to Odin, ensuring the All-Father would never lack for wealth to give as gifts and rewards. And Mjolnir, despite its short handle, went to Thor. The gods deliberated and judged that Mjolnir was the greatest treasure, for it alone could defend Asgard from the giants who constantly threatened them. Brokkr had won the bet. Loki ran. Brokkr and his brother chased him, and eventually, with the gods' help, they caught him. Brokkr prepared to take Loki's head, but the trickster argued that while Brokkr had won the right to his head, he had no right to his neck. "Take the head without touching the neck, if you can," Loki challenged. It was a technicality, a linguistic trick, but the gods upheld it. Instead, Brokkr took an awl and thread and sewed Loki's lips shut, silencing his silver tongue. It was a painful punishment, and when Loki finally tore the stitching free, his mouth was scarred. Once again, Loki had caused a problem through his own mischief, and then created something wonderful in the fixing of it. The gods now possessed their most powerful treasures, the tools that defined them in the stories: Thor's hammer, Odin's spear, Freyr's ship, all because Loki couldn't resist cutting someone's hair and then couldn't resist making a bet. But the pattern was clear. Loki pushed boundaries. He crossed lines, and each time the consequences grew more severe. The gods were learning that Loki was both useful and dangerous. They were learning to watch him, to suspect him, to guard against him, even as they relied on him. And Loki was learning that the gods would forgive him anything, as long as he remained useful. But what would happen when he stopped being useful? What would happen when his tricks went too far to fix? Those questions hung in the air of Asgard, like smoke from a dying fire, waiting for the wind to fan them back into flame. We've touched on the story of the wall builder, but it deserves a deeper look, because it reveals the essential role Loki played in Asgard's politics and the way the gods used him to maintain plausible deniability. After the war with the Vanir, Asgard's defenses were in ruins. The war had been brutal, costly, and had ended in an uneasy truce and the exchange of hostages. The Vanir sent Njord and his children, Freyr and Freya, to live among the Aesir, and in return, the Aesir sent Honir and Mimir to Vanaheim. But the damage to Asgard's walls remained, and the gods had no means to repair them. When the builder arrived with his offer, the gods gathered in their council hall to debate. The price was obviously too high. The sun and moon were not theirs to give away. They belonged to all the worlds. And Freya was not property to be bartered, despite what the gods might have thought about their authority over her. But the work required was immense. The wall needed to be tall enough to keep out even the largest giant, strong enough to withstand any assault, and long enough to encircle all of Asgard's sacred ground. It would take years, perhaps decades, to complete with their own labor. Loki saw the opportunity immediately. Accept the bargain, he urged, but set impossible conditions. The wall must be completed in a single winter before the first day of summer, and the builder must work entirely alone, with no assistance from any man. The gods saw the logic. The builder would fail, obviously. Even a giant couldn't complete such a task in so little time. But they would get several months of free labor, and the wall would be significantly improved before the deadline passed, and they could dismiss the builder with no payment owed. It was clever. It was manipulative. It was the kind of loophole-based thinking that allowed the gods to get what they wanted without technically breaking any oaths or rules. Loki was good at that kind of thinking. The builder agreed to the terms with only one request. He could use his horse. The gods saw no harm in it. After all, the condition was that he work alone, with no help from any man. A horse wasn't a man. They agreed. They should have been more careful with their words. They should have known that in a world where magic was real and giants could disguise themselves, precision mattered. But they were arrogant, confident in their cleverness, and they trusted Loki's scheme. As winter progressed and the wall rose faster than anyone had imagined possible, that confidence evaporated. The builder was clearly no ordinary mason. His strength was enormous, his skill undeniable, and his horse, Svadilfari, was hauling stones that should have required teams of men and pulleys. The gods began to realize they'd been outmaneuvered by one of their own kind, a giant who had seen through their scheme and turned it against them. The builder was going to win. He was going to claim his prize. The panic in Asgard's halls must have been palpable. Odin, the wise All-Father, had been outwitted. Thor, the mighty protector, couldn't simply smash the builder without breaking the sacred rules of hospitality and oath-keeping. Freya was terrified at the prospect of being handed over to a giant, forced to leave her home and live in Jotunheim as a trophy wife. And all of this was Loki's fault. His clever plan had backfired spectacularly. The gods cornered him, The sources say they threatened him with death, with torture, with breaking every bone in his body if he didn't fix this. The oath of blood brotherhood between Loki and Odin didn't protect him here. Even the All-Father couldn't shield him from the collective rage of the entire Aesir pantheon. So Loki did what Loki did best. He found a solution that required him to abandon all dignity, all pride, all semblance of masculine honor as the Norse understood it. He transformed himself into a mare in heat and seduced Svadilfari away from the work. Think about what this means. Loki didn't just create an illusion or distraction. He fully transformed, taking on the complete physical form and biological reality of a female horse. And then he led Svadilfari on a chase through the wilderness that lasted all night, ensuring the stallion couldn't return to the work site until it was too late. The cost of this solution was pregnancy. Loki carried Sleipnir for months, eventually giving birth to the 8-legged foal that would become Odin's mount. Some scholars see this story as containing mockery of Loki, accusing him of ergi, the Old Norse concept of unmanliness or feminine behavior in a male. In Viking Age culture, a man who took the receptive role in sex, or who used feminine magic, or who in any way acted as a woman, was considered deeply shameful. This accusation could lead to duels, blood feuds, and social destruction. By transforming into a mare and being impregnated, Loki had committed the ultimate ergi act. He had literally borne offspring. Some versions of the myths have other gods mocking him for this, calling him Arga, the adjective form of ergi, accusing him of shameful, unmanly behavior. But here's the thing. Loki didn't seem to care. He brought Sleipnir to Odin as a gift, not in shame, but almost proudly. The 8-legged horse was a marvel, a treasure beyond price, and Loki had created it through his sacrifice and transformation. This was part of what made Loki so unsettling to the other gods. He didn't follow their rules. Their concepts of honor and shame didn't bind him. He would do whatever necessary to survive, to succeed, to solve the problem, regardless of what anyone thought about it. And the gods accepted Sleipnir. They accepted the solution. Odin rode the horse across the 9 worlds, using Loki's gift born from shame to increase his own power and mobility. They benefited from Loki's willingness to cross boundaries they wouldn't cross themselves, even as they despised him for it. This is the essential tragedy and contradiction of Loki's place in Asgard. The gods needed him to be shameless so they could remain honorable. They needed him to lie so they could stay truthful. They needed him to break oaths so their word could remain sacred. And Loki played this role again and again, until eventually it destroyed him and everyone around him. Despite the mistrust that often colored their relationship, Loki and Thor adventured together frequently in the surviving myths. Thor, the straightforward warrior god of thunder, and Loki, the cunning trickster, made an odd pair. But they complemented each other in ways that neither would probably admit. Thor had the strength. Loki had the plans. Thor could smash through any physical obstacle. Loki could talk his way past any social one. Together, they represented different aspects of problem solving, and their journeys into Jotunheim and other realms form some of the most entertaining stories in Norse mythology. One of the most famous tales begins with a theft. Thor woke one morning to find Mjolnir, his hammer, missing. Without his weapon, Thor was nearly helpless, and Asgard was vulnerable. The giants could attack at any moment, and without Mjolnir to defend them, the gods would fall. Thor went to Loki immediately, and together they sought Freya's falcon cloak so Loki could fly to Jotunheim and investigate. In bird form, Loki soared over the mountains and frozen wastelands until he reached the hall of Thrym, a powerful giant king. Thrym admitted freely that he had stolen the hammer. He'd hidden it 8 miles beneath the earth, where no one could retrieve it. And he would only return it on one condition: Freya must come to Jotunheim to be his bride. Loki flew back to Asgard with this news, and the gods assembled to discuss the crisis. When they approached Freya with Thrym's demand, her fury was apocalyptic. The hall trembled with her rage. Her precious necklace, Brisingamen, burst from her neck as her chest heaved with indignation. She would not, she declared, go to Jotunheim to marry any giant, no matter what the cost. The gods were stuck. They couldn't retrieve the hammer by force. They couldn't agree to Thrym's terms. They needed another solution. Heimdall, the watchman god, whose senses were so keen he could hear grass growing and see to the edge of the world, suggested a plan. Send Thor to Jotunheim disguised as Freya. Give the giant his bride, and when Mjolnir is brought out to bless the wedding, Thor can seize it and take his revenge. Thor was horrified. He would not dress as a woman. He would not pretend to be a bride. The suggestion was insulting, shameful, ergy beyond measure. He would be mocked for all eternity. But Loki, ever practical, pointed out the alternative. Without Mjolnir, the giants would invade Asgard. The realm would fall. All the gods would die or be enslaved. Was Thor's pride worth more than the survival of all they held dear? Reluctantly, Thor agreed. They dressed him in bridal clothes, covered his face with a veil, and adorned him with Freya's necklace and other jewelry. Loki volunteered to accompany him, disguised as the bridesmaid, both to help maintain the charade and to talk them out of trouble when Thor's temper inevitably threatened to blow their cover. The journey to Jotunheim and the wedding feast that followed is one of the most humorous passages in Norse mythology. Thor, sitting at the feast table in his wedding dress, ate an entire ox and 8 salmon. He drank 3 barrels of mead. The giants watched in astonishment at the bride's appetite. Loki, thinking quickly, explained that Freya had been so excited about the wedding, she hadn't eaten or slept for 8 days and nights. Of course, she was hungry and thirsty now. When Thrym tried to kiss his bride and lifted the veil, he recoiled at the fierce, burning eyes glaring back at him. Again, Loki intervened smoothly. Freya hadn't slept in 8 nights, he reminded Thrym. Her eyes burned with sleepless anticipation of the wedding night. Finally, the moment came. Thrym called for Mjolnir to be brought out and laid in the bride's lap, according to tradition, to bless the union and ensure fertility. The instant the hammer touched Thor's hands, the god ripped off his disguise, laughed at the deception, and proceeded to slaughter Thrym and every giant in the hall. Thor and Loki returned to Asgard triumphant. The hammer recovered, the threat ended. And while Thor endured some teasing about his time as a bride, the general consensus was that the plan had worked. Loki's cunning and Thor's strength had combined to save Asgard once again. But notice the pattern. Once again, Loki created a solution that required someone to cross a boundary of gender and propriety. And once again, while Thor could use violence to escape the consequences once Mjolnir was back in his hands, the initial solution required trickery, disguise, and the willingness to be shameful. Thor could wash away the shame with violence. But Loki, who had suggested the plan and enabled it, carried that association with Ergi with him always. The journey to Utgard Loki. Another journey to Jotunheim shows a different side of Loki and Thor's relationship, and introduces one of the most philosophically interesting characters in Norse mythology, Utgard Loki, whose name means Loki of the outer world, a giant king of such power and cunning that even the trickster god was outmatched. Thor, Loki, and Thor's servants Thialfi and Roskva were traveling through Jotunheim when night fell. They found a strange building with a large hall and smaller side chambers, and they sheltered there. But through the night, the earth shook with terrible tremors, and rumbling sounds echoed like thunder. In the morning, they discovered they'd been sleeping in the glove of a giant named Skrymir, so enormous that his thumb alone formed a side chamber. Skrymir offered to travel with them and even to carry their provisions in his pack. Throughout the day's journey, Skrymir humiliated the travelers. He walked so fast they could barely keep up. When they stopped to camp and wanted to eat, they found the giant had tied his provision pack with knots so complex and strong that even Thor couldn't loosen them. In his frustration and hunger, Thor struck the sleeping giant 3 times with Mjolnir, each blow hard enough to shatter mountains. Each time, Skrymir merely brushed at his head sleepily, wondering if a leaf had fallen on him, or an acorn, or perhaps some debris from a bird's nest. Thor's mightiest weapon, the hammer that had slain countless giants, couldn't even wake this creature. Eventually, Skrymir directed them to Utgard, the fortress of the giant king Utgard Loki, warning them that they would find much larger giants there, and they should be respectful if they wished to leave alive. At Utgard, the giant king greeted them with barely concealed contempt. They were so small, he mocked. Surely they must have some special skills to make up for their size. Everyone in his hall was expected to demonstrate excellence in something. Loki, always ready to prove himself, boasted that no one could eat faster than he could. The giant king accepted the challenge and brought out a servant named Loki. They placed a wooden trough full of meat between Loki and Logi, and at the signal, both began eating from opposite ends, racing toward the middle. Loki ate with desperate speed, consuming meat and gnawing bones clean. But when they met in the middle, Loki had not only eaten all his meat and bones, he'd also consumed the wooden trough itself. Loki had lost. Thialfi, Thor's servant, claimed he could outrun anyone. The giant king set him to race against a young boy named Hugi. 3 times they ran, and 3 times Hugi won easily. Moving so fast, he could run to the end of the course and turn back to meet Thialfi before the human reached the finish line. Finally, Thor was challenged. What could the great god of thunder do? Thor boasted he could outdrink anyone. The giant king brought out a drinking horn and explained that in his hall, a good drinker could drain it in 1 gulp, an average drinker in 2, and even the weakest would finish it in 3. Thor drank deeply, his throat working, swallowing again and again until his lungs burned for air. When he lowered the horn, the level had barely dropped. He tried again, drinking until he thought he would burst. The level dropped a bit more, but was still nearly full. A 3rd time he drank, with all his might, and finally the horn showed some significant decrease, but it was far from empty. Frustrated and embarrassed, Thor asked for a different challenge. The giant king suggested something simple. lift his cat from the floor. It seemed an easy task, but when Thor tried to lift the grey cat, he found he could barely raise one of its paws off the ground. He strained with all his divine strength, and the best he could manage was to make the cat arch its back and lift one foot. Enraged now, Thor demanded a wrestling match. The giant king shrugged and said all his warriors were too strong for such a weakling, but perhaps Thor could wrestle his foster mother, an old woman named Ellie. Thor was insulted, but accepted. The old woman grappled with Thor, and to his horror, he found himself losing. The more he struggled, the firmer her grip became. She forced him to one knee, and the giant king stopped the match, declaring it had gone far enough. Humiliated, Thor and his companions were given food and shelter for the night. In the morning, as they prepared to leave, Utgard Loki walked with them outside the fortress gates. Once they were safely away from his hall, the giant king revealed the truth. Everything they had experienced was illusion, powerful magic designed to humble the gods. Loki had not competed against a servant in the eating contest. Loki was wildfire itself, which consumes everything in its path, wood and bone and all. No living thing could out-eat fire. Hugi, who raced against Thialfi, was thought itself, and nothing in the 9 worlds moves faster than thought. The drinking horn Thor had struggled with was connected to the ocean itself. The fact that Thor had lowered the level at all was astounding. He had drunk enough seawater to create the tides, a feat of strength beyond imagining. The cat Thor couldn't lift was actually Jörmungandr, the world serpent, Loki's own monstrous child who encircled the entire realm of Midgard. That Thor had managed to lift even one of its paws was terrifying to the giants. And Ellie, the old woman who wrestled Thor to his knees, was old age itself. No one, god or giant, mortal or immortal, could defeat age. That Thor had resisted even falling to both knees was a testament to his incredible strength. And Skrymir, the giant they'd met in the forest, that had been Utgard Loki himself in disguise. The 3 blows Thor had struck with Mjolnir had indeed hit, but the giant king had used illusion to redirect them. When Thor looked where Skrymir had been sleeping, he saw 3 valley-deep craters in the earth where the hammer blows had actually landed. Thor, predictably, flew into a rage and raised Mjolnir to destroy Utgard Loki and his entire fortress. But when he turned back, both the giant king and the fortress had vanished completely. They stood in an empty wilderness. All of it had been illusion, magic, tricks of perception, and reality-bending power. This story is fascinating because it shows the limits of even the gods' power. Thor, the strongest of the Aesir, was utterly defeated, not by strength, but by cunning and magic. And Loki, the trickster, the master of deception, was out-tricked by a giant who understood illusion even better than he did. It's a reminder that in Norse mythology, strength alone was never enough. Wisdom, cunning, and the ability to see through deception mattered just as much, if not more. And it shows that while Loki was clever, he was not the cleverest being in the cosmos. There were powers even he didn't fully understand, forces he couldn't manipulate or control. This would become important later, when Loki's confidence in his own cunning led him to make the worst mistake of his existence, the darker turn. For all of Loki's tricks and schemes, for all the times he'd caused problems and fixed them, there was a shift coming, a change in tone, in stakes, in consequences. The stories became darker, the laughter more nervous, the suspicion deeper. Some scholars point to the Loka Senna, Loki's flighting with the gods, as the turning point. This poem, preserved in the Poetic Edda, shows Loki at his absolute worst, deliberately burning every bridge he'd ever built. The scene is a feast held by the sea giant Aegir, who had brewed ale for all the gods in a massive cauldron that Thor and Tyr had helped him acquire. All the Aesir and Essinjur were present, along with the Vanir gods and various other divine beings. It was meant to be a celebration, a moment of peace and fellowship. Loki arrived uninvited. When the gods told him to leave, he reminded Odin of their blood oath, the ancient bond that meant Odin could not feast unless Loki was also welcome. Reluctantly, the gods made space for him. What followed was verbal carnage. Loki insulted every god in the hall, exposing their secrets, mocking their failures, accusing them of cowardice, lechery, and various forms of shame. He told Bragi, the god of poetry, that he was all words and no courage, a coward who hid behind verses. When Bragi's wife Idun defended him, Loki accused her of having embraced her brother's killer with lust-filled arms, a cryptic insult that suggested forbidden relationships or unforgivable compromises. He called Odin a practitioner of ergi, accusing the All-Father of using Seder, a form of magic associated with women, and implying that Odin had acted as a woman in shameful ways. He accused Frigg, Odin's wife, of sleeping with Odin's brothers while her husband wandered the world. Freya came under particular attack. Loki claimed she had slept with every god and elf in the room, including her own brother Freya, and that she'd been caught in the act by the gods, an accusation of incest and promiscuity designed to destroy her reputation. When Njord defended his daughter, Loki mocked him by referencing a time when the giantesses had used him as a urinal, an insult so crude and specific it suggests stories we no longer have. Tyr, the god, who had sacrificed his hand to bind the wolf Fenrir, was mocked both for his missing hand and for his wife's alleged infidelity with Loki himself. When Frey's servant Bigvar interrupted, Loki dismissed him as a chattering pest who made noise while real men talked. Heimdall, the vigilant watchman, was called a servant with a muddy back, suggesting servile status, or perhaps an insult about birth or sexual position. Skadi, the giantess who had married Njord as part of a peace settlement, threatened Loki with binding and torture. Loki responded by claiming he had been first and foremost when her father Thiazi was killed, and that he'd been instrumental in Skadi's own humiliation during her marriage negotiations. On and on, Loki went, methodically insulting each god, exposing secrets that were clearly meant to remain hidden, saying the things everyone knew, but no one spoke aloud. Why? What possessed him to do this? Some see it as Loki simply being true to his nature. He was the truth-teller, the one who exposed hypocrisy. The gods presented themselves as honorable, noble, worthy of worship. But Loki knew the reality. He knew about their affairs, their cowardice, their compromises, and shameful acts. By speaking these truths aloud, he was tearing down their false facades. Others see it as suicidal rage. Loki knew he was an outsider, barely tolerated, used and despised in equal measure. Perhaps he decided to force the confrontation, to make them finally reject him openly, rather than continuing the pretense of acceptance while keeping him at arm's length. Still others see it as the behavior of someone who had simply had enough. Years, perhaps centuries, of being the scapegoat, the one who did the dirty work so the gods could keep their hands clean, had finally broken something in Loki's mind. This was his revenge, petty and verbal, but real. The feast ended when Thor arrived, late from one of his giant-killing expeditions. Thor didn't engage in verbal sparring. He simply threatened Loki with Mjolnir over and over, promising to crush his skull, to send him to hell, to silence him forever. Finally, Loki left, but not before delivering a parting shot. He reminded them all that Aegir's hall would burn, that everything they owned would be destroyed, that their time was limited. It was prophecy, it was threat, it was the promise that whatever consequences came from this night, Loki would make sure everyone suffered, and suffer they would. Because what came next was not a clever scheme gone wrong or a harmless prank. What came next was murder, the death of the most beloved god in all of Asgard, orchestrated by Loki with cold calculation and malicious intent. The death of Baldr, the beautiful, the innocent, the good. The death that would begin the final countdown to Ragnarök, the end of all things. Baldr was perfect, not in the flawed, complicated way the other gods were powerful or wise or beautiful. Baldr was genuinely good, kind, pure in a way that seemed almost out of place in the harsh cosmos of Norse mythology. He was the son of Odin and Frigg, brother to Thor and Hod, and he was loved by everyone. His face shone with inner light. His judgment was wise. His presence brought peace and joy. When Baldr was in the room, conflict settled, anger faded, and everything seemed brighter. This made what Loki did even worse. It began with dreams. Baldr started having nightmares, visions of his own death, dark premonitions that filled him with inexplicable dread. In Norse culture, dreams were significant, prophetic, messages from the Norns, or glimpses of fate itself. These were not mere anxieties, but warnings. Baldr told his mother Frigg about the dreams, and the goddess was immediately alarmed. She loved all her sons, but Baldr was special, the best of them, the one who embodied everything good about the Aesir. The thought of losing him was unbearable. Frigg decided to act. She traveled throughout all the 9 worlds, extracting oaths from everything in existence. She spoke to fire and water, to iron and steel, to every kind of metal, every stone, every tree, every disease, every animal, every bird, every poison and venom. She made each of them swear an oath that they would never harm Baldr. It was an act of love so thorough, so comprehensive, that it seemed to cover every possibility. How could Baldr be harmed if nothing in existence would hurt him? When Frigg returned to Asgard and announced what she'd done, the gods were relieved, and then, in the way of immortal beings with few entertainments, they decided to test it. They made a game of Baldr's invulnerability. In the fields outside the Great Hall, they took turns throwing things at Baldr. Stones bounced off harmlessly. Arrows veered away mid-flight. Swords refused to cut. Axes wouldn't bite. They threw rocks and spears, shot arrows, struck with hammers, and nothing could touch him. Baldr stood in the center of this onslaught, laughing, unharmed, the center of their joy and amazement. Everyone participated in this game. Everyone except Loki, who watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable, and Hod, Baldr's blind brother, who couldn't participate because he couldn't see to aim. Loki approached Frigg, who was watching the games with maternal pride and relief. He disguised himself as an old woman and struck up a conversation with the Queen of the Gods. "What are they doing to Baldr?" the disguised Loki asked innocently. Frigg explained about the oaths, how she'd made everything in creation promise not to harm her son. Everything, Loki pressed. Absolutely everything swore the oath. Frigg, proud and perhaps a bit boastful, confirmed it. Well, everything, except for one small plant. There was a mistletoe growing west of Valhalla, a tiny, insignificant thing. It seemed too young, too harmless to bother with. She hadn't made it swear. Loki now had what he needed. He left Frigg's presence, dropped the disguise, and went to find the mistletoe. It was indeed small, young, a parasitic plant growing on an oak tree, overlooked and unremarkable. Loki cut it carefully, fashioned it into a dart or a short spear, depending on which version of the story you read, and returned to the games. Hod stood apart from the others, listening to the sounds of laughter and the thunk of projectiles bouncing harmlessly off his brother. Loki approached him with sympathy in his voice. "Why don't you participate in honoring your brother?" Loki asked. Hod explained his blindness. He couldn't see where Baldr stood. He had nothing to throw anyway. Loki offered to help. He had a small branch here, nothing significant. And he would guide Hod's hand, help him aim. That way, Hod could join in the celebration, like everyone else. Hod, trusting and wanting to participate in honoring his beloved brother, agreed. Loki placed the mistletoe dart in Hod's hand, positioned him carefully, and guided his arm back. Then he helped Hod throw. The mistletoe flew straight and true. It pierced Baldr's heart. The god of light, the beautiful, the beloved, fell dead without a sound. The laughter stopped. The games ended. Silence fell over the field like a physical weight. Baldr, the invulnerable, the good, the pure, lay dead from a tiny plant that no one had thought to fear. And Loki, his role undetected for the moment, slipped away into the confusion and grief, leaving Hod standing there, blind and bewildered, the unwitting weapon of his brother's murder. The silence that followed Baldr's fall was the silence of a world breaking. The gods stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. The impossible had occurred. The one who could not be harmed was dead. Frigg's scream, when it came, was said to shake the branches of Yggdrasil itself. She rushed to her son's body, cradling him, calling his name, but Baldr's spirit had already begun its journey to Helheim. The warmth was leaving his perfect flesh. The gods began to speak, to shout, to demand answers. How did this happen? What had struck him? Who had thrown it? Hod, still holding the empty air where the mistletoe had been, still blind and confused, tried to explain. Someone had helped him. A voice in the darkness, a guiding hand. He had only wanted to honor his brother, like everyone else. Some of the gods, in their grief and rage, moved toward Hod, ready to strike him down for kinslaying, the worst of all crimes. But they were in a sacred space, a place of sanctuary, and even in their anguish, they couldn't break that law. Blood could not be shed here, not now. And besides, they realized Hod was a victim too. Someone had used him, manipulated him, turned him into a weapon against his own brother. But who? The answer was obvious to anyone who thought about it. Who else would conceive such a scheme? Who else moved through the world with such cunning and malice? Who else had motive to strike at the god's happiness? Loki was gone. He'd vanished from Asgard before anyone could question him. But first, they had to deal with Baldr's death. The funeral preparations began immediately, and they were worthy of the god of light himself. Baldr's body was placed on his ship, Ringhorni, the greatest ship ever built, so large that the gods couldn't launch it by themselves. They had to summon Hyrrokin, a giantess of immense strength who rode to Asgard on a wolf using serpents for reins. She pushed the ship into the water with such force that the rollers it sat on caught fire, and the earth trembled. Nanna, Baldr's wife, died of grief when she saw her husband's body placed on the funeral ship. Her heart literally broke from sorrow. They placed her body beside his and added Baldr's horse, still wearing its saddle, so the god would have a mount in the afterlife. Odin placed his ring, Draupnir, the one that dripped 8 new golden rings every 9th night, onto Baldr's funeral pyre. It was a sacrifice of enormous wealth, but also a symbol. The All-Father was giving his son something precious, something that would continue to generate value, even in the realm of the dead. As the ship burned and floated out to sea, carrying Baldr and Nanna to whatever awaited them, the gods stood on the shore and wept. Thor's face was red with rage and tears. Odin's single eye streamed with sorrow. Frigg's grief was so profound she could barely stand. But Frigg was not ready to accept this loss. She called out, asking if anyone among the gods loved her enough to ride to Helheim and attempt to bring Baldr back. The price would be paid, the journey would be rewarded. But who was brave enough to travel to the realm of the dead and bargain with Hel herself? Hermod, another of Odin's sons, stepped forward. He would go. He would face the terrors of the road to Helheim and speak to the Queen of the Dead on Baldr's behalf. Odin gave him Sleipnir to ride, the 8-legged horse born from Loki in mare form, the fastest mount in all the 9 worlds. Hermod would need that speed. The journey to Helheim was long and dangerous, and time was critical. For 9 nights, Hermod rode through dark valleys and across bridges that spanned chasms of endless depth. He traveled through Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist, where the cold was so intense it could freeze the breath in your lungs. Finally, he reached the gates of Helheim, locked and guarded. Sleipnir jumped the gates in a single leap, landing inside the realm of the dead without permission or challenge. Hermod rode on to Hel's great hall, Eljudnir, where the dead gathered in silent crowds. There, sitting on a high seat, was Baldr himself, with Nanna beside him. They looked pale, ghostly, but recognizable. Hermod called to his brother, but Baldr could not leave his seat. He was in Hel's realm now, subject to her rules. Hermod found Hel herself and made his plea. Baldr was loved by all creation. His death had brought unbearable grief to gods and mortals alike. Surely his death was a mistake, an injustice. Would Hel consider releasing him? Hel listened with her half-living, half-dead face, one eye bright, one eye clouded with decay. When Hermod finished, she spoke. If what he said was true, if Baldr truly was loved by all creation, then all creation should mourn for him. If everything in the 9 worlds would weep for Baldr, she would release him. But if even one thing refused to cry, Baldr would remain in Helheim forever. It seemed possible. Baldr was beloved. Surely everything would weep for him. Hermod rode back to Asgard with this message, and the gods immediately set to work. They sent messengers to every corner of the 9 worlds, asking everything to weep for Baldr, and everything did. Humans wept. The Aesir wept. The Vanir wept. The elves and dwarves shed tears. Animals howled with sorrow. Trees wept sap. Stones wept dew. Metals wept rust and moisture. Fire itself seemed to weep, flickering low in its grief. Water flowed in tears, rivers swelling with the collective mourning of creation. The messengers returned, confident that the condition had been met. Everything had wept for Baldr. But then, in a cave far from Asgard, the messengers encountered a giantess named Thok. She was old, hunched, her face hidden in shadows. When asked to weep for Baldr, Thok refused. "Let hell hold what she has," the giantess said. "Baldr brought me no joy in life. Why should I grieve him in death?" The messengers begged, pleaded, explained the importance, but Thok would not cry, not a single tear. And so the condition failed. One creature in all the 9 worlds had refused to mourn, and that was enough. Baldr would remain in Helheim. The messengers returned with this devastating news, and the gods' grief turned to rage. Because they all knew, that Thok was no random giantess. Thok was Loki in disguise. He had killed Baldr. And now, with one final act of malice, he had ensured Baldr would never return. The god of light would remain in the land of shadows until Ragnarök, until the end of all things. Loki had gone too far. This was no clever trick gone wrong. This was no prank that could be fixed. This was murder, deliberate and calculated, followed by an act of such cruelty that it took away even the hope of redemption. The gods had tolerated Loki's tricks for centuries. They had forgiven his transgressions because he was useful, because Odin's oath protected him, because he always found a way to fix the problems he caused. But you can't fix death. You can't unpay that price. The hunt for Loki began immediately. Loki knew what was coming. He'd known the moment he refused to weep as Thok. Perhaps he'd known even before that, when he guided Hod's hand and sent the mistletoe flying. This was the line that couldn't be uncrossed, and Loki had sprinted across it and then set it on fire behind him. He fled from Asgard and went into the mountains to a remote place where he could see in all directions. There, he built a house with 4 doors, one facing each direction, so he could watch for the gods' approach from any angle. During the days, he transformed himself into a salmon and hid in the waters of a waterfall in a deep pool where the current was strongest. He felt safe there, hidden in the churning water, his sleek fish body perfectly adapted to the environment. But during the nights, when he was alone in his mountain house, Loki began to worry. How would the gods catch him? He knew they would try. He knew Odin would use his wisdom and foresight to hunt him down. But how? As he sat by his fire one evening, Loki began to think like a hunter. If he were trying to catch a salmon, how would he do it? His clever mind began to work through the problem. You could use a spear, but in rushing water, that would be difficult. You could use your hands, but a salmon was too fast, too slippery. Then the idea came to him. You could use some kind of mesh, a woven net of cords that would trap the fish without requiring precision strikes. He began to work with linen thread, knotting it together in a pattern, creating the first fishing net. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice Odin approaching until it was almost too late. The All-Father, who could see all the 9 worlds from his high seat, had finally spotted Loki's hiding place. Loki threw the half-finished net into the fire and dove out one of the doors, racing for the waterfall. He transformed mid-leap and hit the water as a salmon, shooting down into the deepest part of the pool. The gods arrived moments later. They searched the house and found the net burning in the fire. Kvasir, the wisest of all beings, created from the mead of peace between the Aesir and Vanir, studied the pattern of the burned cords. He understood immediately what it was and what Loki had been planning. The gods finished the net Loki had started, following his own design. They took it to the waterfall and began to drag it through the water. Loki, in salmon form, felt the net coming and swam ahead of it, staying just out of reach. The gods dragged the net all the way through the waterfall pool, but Loki escaped by swimming out to the fjord, where the river met the sea. The gods regrouped. They weighted the net with stones to make it drag along the bottom, ensuring no fish could swim beneath it. Thor waded along one bank, and the other gods spread across the opposite side. Together, they dragged the net through the water again. This time, Loki couldn't swim under the net or around it. His only option was to leap over it, to jump out of the water and hope to clear the cords and escape downstream. He gathered all his strength and jumped, his salmon body arcing through the air in a silvery flash. But Thor was waiting. The thunder god's reflexes were lightning quick. He grabbed Loki mid-air, his massive hand closing around the salmon's slippery body. Loki thrashed, trying to slide free, his fish body writhing with desperate strength. Thor's grip slipped backward, but his fingers finally clamped tight around the tail. He held on with all his might, and slowly Loki's strength faded. The transformation could no longer be maintained. In Thor's hands, the salmon became a god again, exhausted, dripping, caught. This, scholars tell us, is why salmon have tapered tails, narrow at the back. Thor's grip squeezed that shape into the species forever, a reminder of the day the trickster god was finally caught. The gods bound Loki with chains and dragged him to a cave deep underground. They weren't gentle. The blood oath between Odin and Loki was broken now, shattered by Baldr's murder. Whatever protection that ancient bond had provided was gone. But the gods' vengeance went further than just binding Loki. They brought his sons, Narfi and Vali, the innocent children of Loki and Sigyn, into the cave. They transformed Vali into a wolf, using magic to strip away his humanity and reason, leaving only animal rage and hunger. The wolf that had been Vali looked at his brother Narfi and saw only prey. Narfi tried to run, tried to plead with his brother, but Vali tore him apart, disemboweling him in a frenzy of violence. The gods watched this happen. They allowed it, orchestrated it, used one son to kill the other as punishment for their father's crimes. Then they took Narfi's entrails, still warm, and used them as bindings. They tied Loki to 3 sharp rocks, using his own son's guts as rope. And as if by some terrible magic, the entrails hardened into iron chains, unbreakable and cold. Skadi, the giantess who had once married into the Aesir as part of a peace settlement, had particular reason to hate Loki. He had been involved in the death of her father Thiazi, the giant who had kidnapped Idun. She took a venomous serpent and fastened it above Loki's face, positioned so that its poison would drip directly onto him. The snake hung there, fangs bared, venom dripping steadily. This was Loki's punishment, not death, because the gods wanted him to suffer, not imprisonment alone, but constant, unending torment. Every drop of venom that hit his face burned like fire, searing his skin, causing agony that would never fade or become tolerable through familiarity. But Sigyn, Loki's wife, the one being in all the 9 worlds who still loved him, came to the cave. She would not abandon him. She took a bowl and sat beside her bound husband, holding it above his face to catch the venom before it could hit him. She sits there still, in the darkness, holding that bowl, patient, loyal, faithful beyond reason. But the bowl fills, and when it does, Sigyn must turn away to empty it. In those moments, venom drips onto Loki's face. He writhes in agony, his whole body convulsing, thrashing against the chains. And when Loki convulses, the earth itself shakes. These are earthquakes. Every tremor, every quake is Loki writhing in his bonds as poison burns his face, while his wife rushes to return with an empty bowl. This is how the gods punish the trickster. This is the price of Baldr's death, but it's not the end of the story. Because the prophecies were clear, Loki would not remain bound forever. The chains would break, and when they did, Ragnarök would be at hand. The prophecy of Ragnarök. The Norns, the three weavers of fate, had seen the future. Odin himself had ridden to Helheim and raised a dead Völva, a seeress, from her grave to tell him what was coming. The prophecies were clear, and they were terrible. The end of all things wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty, woven into the fabric of fate itself, as inevitable as winter following autumn, as unavoidable as death. It would begin with winters, 3 of them, harsh and unrelenting, with no summer between. This was the Fimbul winter, the great winter that would devastate Midgard. Crops would fail, livestock would freeze, humanity would turn on itself, fighting over dwindling resources, brother killing brother, family bonds breaking under the weight of starvation and cold. The sun and moon, pursued since the beginning of time by the wolves, Skoll and Hati, would finally be caught and devoured. Darkness would fall across all the worlds. The stars would disappear from the sky. The very heavens would go dark. And in that darkness, the bonds would break. Fenrir, the great wolf, son of Loki, would break free from the magical ribbon Gleipnir that the gods had used to bind him. The wolf's jaws would gape open, so wide that his lower jaw would scrape the earth and his upper jaw would touch the sky. Everything in his path would be devoured. Jörmungandr, the world serpent, would release its tail and thrash in the ocean, creating tidal waves that would flood the lands. The serpent would crawl onto shore, spewing venom that would poison the air and water, making the sky itself deadly to breathe. And Loki would break free from his chains in the cave. The earthquake that had been periodic, occasional, would become constant as he tore himself loose from the rocks and the iron that had held him for so long. Loki would emerge from his prison, still burned by venom, still twisted by centuries of torture, and he would be filled with rage, not the playful mischief of his earlier days, not the clever trickster's spite. This would be pure hatred, concentrated by time and pain into something absolute. He would call to his children, to the monsters the gods had imprisoned and feared. He would rally them for the final battle. In Jotunheim, the giants would hear the call. Hrym would captain the ship Naglfar, built entirely from the fingernails and toenails of the dead, a vessel of death itself. The frost giants and fire giants would gather, ancient enemies united in their hatred of the Aesir. From Muspelheim would come Surtur, the fire giant who had guarded that realm since before the world was made. He would ride out with his flaming sword, bringing fire that could consume anything, even the gods themselves. Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, would stand on the rainbow bridge Bifrost and blow his horn Gjallarhorn, the sound echoing through all 9 worlds, calling the Aesir to their final battle. The gods would arm themselves. Odin would take Gungnir, his spear. Thor would lift Mjolnir one last time. Tyr would draw his sword, despite missing the hand Fenrir had bitten off in his youth. Frey would look for his sword and remember he'd given it away for love, and he would face the end armed only with an antler. They would ride out from Asgard to the field of Vigrid, a plain so vast it stretched 100 leagues in every direction. And there they would meet their doom. The final battle, Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, the end of everything. The armies would meet on Vigrid, and the battle would be like nothing the 9 worlds had ever seen. Not a war for territory or treasure, not a conflict that could be won or lost, but mutual destruction. Both sides fighting, knowing they would die, fighting anyway, because that was their nature, their fate, their final purpose. Odin would face Fenrir, the great wolf who had been prophesied to kill him since before Loki's son was even born. The All-Father, who had sought wisdom all his life, who had sacrificed so much to see the future, would ride against the monster, knowing exactly how it would end. Fenrir's jaws would close on Odin, swallowing the king of the gods whole. The All-Father would die in darkness, consumed by the wolf he had tried and failed to prevent from fulfilling its destiny. But Vidar, Odin's son, the silent god of vengeance, would step forward. He wore a special boot made from all the leather scraps that had ever been cut from shoes throughout human history, strengthened by every person who had ever trimmed their footwear. Vidar would place this boot on Fenrir's lower jaw, grab the upper jaw with his hands, and tear the wolf's mouth apart, killing it in revenge for his father. Thor would confront Jörmungandr, the world serpent, his ancient enemy. They had clashed before during Thor's journey to Utgard Loki's hall, when Thor had tried to lift the serpent disguised as a cat, and later when Thor had gone fishing and caught the serpent on a line, nearly dragging it from the ocean before a giant cut the line in fear. Now they would fight their final battle. Thor would strike with Mjolnir, and the blows would crush the serpent's skull, shattering the bones, killing the monster at last. But Jörmungandr's dying act would be to spew venom across Thor. The god of thunder would take 9 steps back from the serpent's corpse before the poison overcame him, and he would fall dead. Tyr would fight Garm, the great hound that guarded Helheim's gates. They would kill each other in single combat, both falling simultaneously. Heimdall and Loki would find each other on the battlefield. The Watchman and the Trickster, opposites in every way, would meet for the final time. Heimdall, who had always been vigilant, always alert, always defending. Loki, who had always slipped past defenses, always found the weakness, always broken what others tried to protect. They would fight with all the hatred of centuries, all the betrayals and suspicions and conflicts finally coming to a head. And they would kill each other, dying together, locked in mutual destruction. Frey, the god of fertility and peace, would face Surtur, the fire giant. Without his sword, armed only with an antler, Frey would fight bravely and futilely. Surtur's flaming blade would cut him down, and the giant would move on, unstoppable. All across Vigrid, gods and giants would clash and die. The 9 worlds would shake with the violence. Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, would shatter under the weight of Surtur's army. Yggdrasil itself would tremble. And when the battle was done, when the last god had fallen and the last giant lay dead or dying, Surtur would raise his sword and set the world on fire. The flames would consume everything. Asgard would burn, Midgard would burn, the forests would burn, the mountains would melt, the seas would boil, the sky itself would be engulfed in fire. Everything the gods had built, every realm, every achievement, every story would burn to ash. The earth would sink into the sea. The stars would go dark. The age of the gods would end, not with a whimper, but with fire and flood and absolute destruction. This was Ragnarök. This was the destiny Loki's children would help fulfill. This was the end that Loki himself would enable by breaking free, by rallying the forces of chaos, by becoming the banner under which all the enemies of order would gather. So what do we make of Loki, looking back across the centuries? In the original Norse sources, the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, Loki is complicated and contradictory. He helps the gods and harms them. He's useful and dangerous. He's Odin's blood brother and the murderer of Odin's son. He's the father of monsters and the mother of Odin's horse. The Vikings who worshipped the Norse gods didn't seem to worship Loki. There are no temples to him, no prayers, no evidence of cult practice. He existed in the stories, essential to the mythology, but he wasn't a god you appealed to for help or honored with sacrifice. Some scholars think Loki represents chaos, the force of disorder that exists alongside and in tension with order. Without chaos, there's no change, no growth, no possibility. But chaos unchecked destroys everything. The gods needed Loki to solve problems, but they also needed to control him, to limit him, or he would tear everything apart. Others see him as a scapegoat figure, someone who does the dirty work that civilization requires but can't acknowledge. Every society needs people to cross boundaries, to do the unthinkable, to make the hard choices. But those people are also condemned for it, blamed for the very actions that benefited everyone. Still, others interpret Loki through the lens of queer theory, noting his gender fluidity, his willingness to cross boundaries of sex and form, his ability to be pregnant and give birth. In a culture that valued rigid gender roles and punished deviation from them, Loki represented everything that challenged those categories. He might also represent the outsider, the immigrant, the one who lives between cultures. Born a giant but living among gods, never fully accepted by either, Loki embodies the experience of not belonging, of being tolerated, but never truly welcomed. In modern popular culture, Loki has become perhaps the most famous figure from Norse mythology besides Thor. Marvel's version, portrayed by Tom Hiddleston, made him a household name, though the character in the movies bears only a passing resemblance to the mythological trickster. Modern Loki is often portrayed as misunderstood, redeemable, someone whose villainy comes from pain and rejection. The myths are darker. Mythological Loki kills an innocent god and ensures he stays dead. He murders children and laughs about it. He insults grieving parents and mocks the suffering he's caused. But he's also the one who retrieves Idun, who gets Sif new hair, who helps create the treasures that make the gods powerful, who solves problems no one else can solve. Maybe that's the point. Maybe Loki isn't meant to be redeemable or sympathetic. Maybe he's meant to be necessary and terrible, useful and unforgivable. The price paid for order and the agent of its destruction both. The Vikings understood that the world was brutal, that survival required hard choices, that the line between hero and villain was often just a matter of perspective and timing. Loki embodied that understanding. He shows us that cleverness without ethics is dangerous, that being useful doesn't make you good, that every society creates its own monsters by deciding who belongs and who doesn't, who deserves honor and who deserves contempt. Loki's story is a tragedy, but not in the sense that he's a sympathetic character brought down by fate. It's a tragedy in that it was always going to end this way. From the moment the gods let a giant live among them, from the moment Odin swore blood brotherhood with chaos itself, the seeds of Ragnarök were planted. Loki didn't destroy the gods from the outside. He destroyed them from within, using the knowledge he'd gained as one of them, exploiting the weaknesses he'd observed, turning their own rules and values against them. And they had enabled it every step of the way by using him when convenient and condemning him when not, by accepting his gifts while despising the giver, by keeping him close because he was useful, but never truly including him because of what he was. In the end, everyone got what the prophecies promised. The gods got their Ragnarök, Loki got his revenge, and the 9 worlds burned. So here we are, at the end of a Loki's story, or at least at the end of the stories that survived. We've followed him from his mysterious origins as a giant living among gods, through his tricks and schemes, his gifts and betrayals, to his terrible revenge and final fate. We've seen him help create the treasures that define the gods and the monsters that would destroy them. We've watched him shift between genders and species, between ally and enemy, between useful and unforgivable. And we've seen the cosmos burn because of him, because of his pain and rage and refusal to accept his place in the order the gods tried to maintain. Loki's story is not comfortable. It doesn't have clear morals or easy lessons. It doesn't tell us that good triumphs over evil, or that cleverness always pays off, or that the underdog wins in the end. Instead, it tells us that intelligence without ethics is dangerous. That exclusion breeds resentment, that using people while despising them creates enemies. That chaos, when bound too tightly, eventually explodes with terrible force. It tells us that some prices must be paid, some consequences can't be avoided, some relationships are doomed from the start. But it also tells us that change is necessary, even when it's destructive, that the old must burn for the new to grow, that even the gods, in all their power and glory, couldn't escape their fate. And it reminds us that the world is more complicated than heroes and villains, that sometimes the same person can be both savior and destroyer, that morality is messier than we'd like to believe. These are hard truths, cold truths, the kind that keep you awake at night, wondering about the nature of justice and revenge and redemption. But they're also the truths that make mythology matter, that make these old stories relevant centuries after the people who first told them vanished into history. So as you drift off now, let the image of Loki fade, bound in his cave, venom dripping, Sigyn faithfully holding her bowl. Let the memory of Ragnarök settle like ash, the gods and giants locked in final battle, the world burning, the darkness falling. Let the promise of rebirth whisper like wind through new grass, the earth rising green from the sea, the survivors gathering, the golden pieces glinting in the sun. Loki's story ends in fire and darkness, but it also ends in the possibility of something better, something new, something not yet corrupted by the mistakes and betrayals of the old world. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not that tricksters are good or bad, useful or dangerous, but that destruction and creation are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. The price of a new world is the death of the old one. And Loki, for all his faults and crimes and terrible choices, was the one willing to pay that price, not out of nobility, not out of wisdom, but out of rage and pain and the simple refusal to accept things as they were. He burned the cosmos down, and from those ashes, something new could grow. If this story helped you rest, helped you drift into sleep with gods and giants and tricksters dancing through your dreams, consider liking and subscribing. Let me know if you side with the trickster. The gods are sleeping now. The trickster is bound. The world has ended and begun again. And you can rest too, knowing that even the greatest powers must face their fate, that even the cleverest minds can't escape the consequences of their choices, that everything ends and everything begins over and over, like the turning of seasons or the rising of the sun. Sleep well. Dream of Asgard's golden halls and Jotunheim's frozen mountains. Dream of clever schemes and terrible prices, of blood brothers and broken bonds, of chaos and order locked in eternal dance. And when you wake, remember, we're all playing both roles, God and trickster, order and chaos, helping and harming, building and breaking. The only question is which one you'll choose to be today. Good night.